On a cold Tuesday morning, a young woman walked into a roadside diner and sat at the far end of the counter. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. When Daniel Reeves set a plate in front of her without being asked, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out the last crumpled bills she had left in the world. He looked at the money, then at her. He slid the bills back and said quietly, "Pay me when you're the boss." She left without another word. 5 years later, a limousine stopped outside that same diner, and the room went still. The diner didn't have a name worth remembering. A hand-painted sign above the door, a parking lot with 3 cracked lines of bell above the entrance that rang, whether you pushed the door hard or soft. It sat at the edge of a 2-lane road, in a part of town that hadn't changed much in 30 years, not because people loved it the way it was, but because nobody had gotten around to doing anything about it. The booths were worn smooth from use. The laminate on the counter had lifted at the corners, and the coffee pot on the burner had been the same model since before Daniel Reeves started working there. Daniel had taken the job 6 years ago and never left. He was a single father, which meant his life had been organized around necessity for a long time. Steady income, predictable hours, no room for disruption. The morning shift gave him all 3. He knew every regular by name and order. He knew which tables wobbled and needed a folded napkin under one leg, that the lunch rush started at 11:45 and not noon, and that the owner, a quiet man named Gerald, preferred not to speak before his second cup. Daniel was not the kind of man who complained about his circumstances. He simply moved through his days with a calm that people noticed without being able to explain. That Tuesday in early November, the cold had come in overnight and stayed. The diner was half full by 8 in the morning, a couple of regulars at the counter, a table of contractors in work boots near the window, an older woman with a paperback in the corner booth. Daniel was moving between the kitchen and the floor plates, balanced on his forearm, refilling coffees without being asked. An ordinary morning by every measure. Then the bell above the door rang, and Evelyn Carter walked in. She was in her late 20s, though she looked older in the way exhaustion ages a person from the inside out. Her coat was clean, but thin for the weather, and she carried a bag that looked packed in a hurry and never fully unpacked. She walked to the far end of the counter and sat down slowly, the way someone sits when they're not sure they have the right to take up space. She didn't pick up the menu. She didn't look around. She set her hands flat on the counter and stared at a fixed point in front of her, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from having used up everything else. Daniel noticed her the way he noticed most things in that diner, quietly, without making a production of it. He set a glass of water in front of her without asking. She looked up briefly and gave a small nod, the kind that takes effort. He went back to his other tables, but he kept her in the edge of his vision. 20 minutes passed. She didn't order. She didn't leave. She just sat there with her hands flat on the counter, and once, when she thought no one was watching, she pressed her eyes shut for a moment longer than a blink. He didn't need to ask why she wasn't ordering. Daniel went to the kitchen and put in an order. Eggs toast, a side of home fries, a cup of coffee. When the plate came up, he carried it out himself and set it in front of her, without a word. Evelyn looked at the food, then up at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite gratitude, and not quite confusion. It was the look of someone who had been bracing for the world to be unkind for so long that a small act of decency had temporarily short-circuited her. "I didn't order this," she said. Her voice was steady, but just barely. Daniel picked up the coffee pot and filled her cup. "I know," he said. "Eat while it's hot." She didn't argue. She ate not fast, not ravenous, but carefully, like she was trying to make it last. Daniel went back to his other tables and let her be. The contractors argued about a job site. The woman in the corner booth turned a page. The morning moved on the way mornings do when nothing unusual is supposed to be happening. When Evelyn finished, she sat for a moment with both hands wrapped around the coffee cup, Then she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out a small fold of bills, crumpled and soft at the edges, the kind of money that had been counted and recounted many times. She set them on the counter and smoothed them flat with her palm, the way a person does when they want something small to look like more than it is. There were maybe $12 or $13, not enough for the plate, and she knew it. Daniel came back to the counter, looked at the bills, and looked at her. "That's all I have on me right now," Evelyn said. "But I can bring the rest later this week." She said it evenly without apology, the way someone speaks when they've decided that dignity is the one thing they're not giving up. Daniel picked up the bills and held them out to her. She didn't take them. Her jaw tightened slightly, and she met his eyes for the first time since she'd walked in. "I'm not taking your charity," she said. "I'm not offering charity," Daniel said. He set the bills back down in front of her. "Put that away." He leaned one arm against the counter, not in a way that was familiar or presumptuous, just the way a person stands when they want to say something and mean it. "Pay me when you are the boss." The words landed without drama. He said them the same way he might read off the soup special, but there was nothing casual about the thing underneath them. He wasn't performing generosity for an audience. He looked at her like he already knew something about her that she had stopped believing about herself. Evelyn stared at him. She was looking for the angle, the pity, the condescension, the quiet superiority that sometimes hides inside generosity. There was none of that in his face. He meant it exactly the way it sounded. She folded the bills and put them back in her pocket. She picked up her bag and stood. For a moment she looked at the empty plate and at the man on the other side of the counter, who had just offered her something she didn't know how to name yet. Then she walked to the door and pushed it open, and the bell rang once. She was gone. Daniel picked up her cup and plate and carried them to the kitchen. Gerald was leaning against the back counter with his second cup of coffee. "Friend of yours?" Gerald asked. "No," Daniel said, turning on the faucet. "Never seen her before." Gerald looked at him for a moment, then went back to his coffee. Outside, Evelyn walked down the 2-lane road with her hands in her coat pockets. The cold was sharp against her face, and the bag on her shoulder was heavier than it looked. She walked without knowing exactly where she was going, which had been true for longer than just that morning. But somewhere between the diner and wherever the road ahead led, something had shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that makes a person stop and look around. More like a weight that had been pressing straight down, had tilted just slightly off-center. She kept walking, and the words followed her in the silence. "When you're the boss. Not if. When." The first few weeks after that Tuesday, Evelyn told herself the diner didn't matter. It was a meal, a stranger's generosity, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and means nothing beyond the moment it occurred. She had real problems to manage a sublet, running out a phone shut off twice in 30 days, and a name in the startup world that now carried the specific kind of damage that follows a public failure. People remembered her, not the way she had once hoped, but in the way that makes rooms go slightly quieter when you walk in. Her company had folded 8 months earlier, not slowly fast, and visibly the kind of collapse that gets 3 sentences in an industry newsletter and becomes a cautionary example in someone's pitch meeting 2 years later. The product had been real. The problem it solved had been real. But the timing had been wrong. The funding had dried up at the worst possible moment, and 2 co-founders had walked before the end, taking pieces of the infrastructure with them. By the time it was over, Evelyn had signed her name to more debt than she could say out loud, without her chest tightening, and she had no one left in her corner who wasn't also managing their own distance from the wreckage. She reached out to former contacts, carefully professionally. Most replied with something warm, in tone, non-committal in substance, and closed at the end. One investor she had known for 3 years took the meeting, listened to her for 20 minutes, and told her gently that the market wasn't ready to trust her again yet. He said it like it was useful information. She thanked him, took the elevator down 14 floors, and stood on the sidewalk staring at nothing for a long time. That was the shape of the first year. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow, grinding work of being a person who had failed publicly and was now trying to figure out what came next in a world that had already moved on without her. She picked up consulting work where she could find it small projects, short contracts, enough to keep the lights on, but not enough to rebuild anything. She spent evenings with a legal pad and a laptop sketching ideas and crossing them out because every path she mapped ran into the same wall, no capital, no network willing to move on her behalf, and a track record with an asterisk next to everything that came before it. By the second year, she had started to believe the version of herself that other people seemed to have already accepted, that she had had one shot and missed it, and the most reasonable thing now was to find a way to be something smaller and more manageable than what she had once wanted to be. It was a quiet kind of surrender. She hadn't made a decision to give up so much as she had stopped making decisions at all. She went through the motions. She got up. She worked. She slept. She told herself this was just a phase that she would know when the time was right to try again. But the weeks kept passing, and the time never felt right, and the legal pad on her kitchen table started collecting dust. It was late at night in the middle of that second winter, long past midnight, in an apartment too cold because she'd been putting off calling the landlord, that she found herself at the kitchen table with nothing in front of her but a cup of tea that had gone cold. She wasn't thinking about her company or her debt or the investor who had turned her away. She was just sitting there in the quiet and without choosing to. She thought about the diner. She thought about the plate set in front of her without being asked, the $12 smoothed flat on the counter with her palm, and Daniel Reeves on the other side setting the bills back, saying it without pity, without performance. Pay me when you're the boss. Not if things turn around. When? She sat with that for a long time. Something about the memory, the flatness of his voice, the certainty in it, made the version of herself she had been slowly becoming feel suddenly ill-fitting, like a coat that belonged to someone else. He hadn't looked at her with hope or with encouragement. He had looked at her with certainty, and those are not the same thing. Hope requires doubt. Certainty doesn't. She had spent 2 years treating his words like something she could file away and move past.